Hey y'all, I'm Hope. Welcome back to my channel. Jacob is also here.
Hello.
Hanging out off to the side here. And today we're going to be doing our year-end wrap-up, which has become a bit of a tradition for us. This is, I think, our third year? Yeah, third sounds right. So this is our third year doing this together. We always have a lot of fun doing this, so we wanted to do it again this year. But the plan is we're going to run through both of our stats, and then we're going to talk about our worst book of the year, our most disappointing book of the year, a few honorable mentions, and then we each have a top 3 of our favorites for the year. So I think that's pretty much the plan. I think that's all of the rambling that is necessary. So I think let's just dive in.
Right on. Let's do it.
Do you want to start with your stats?
Yeah, so for 2023, I'm just pulling my stats straight from Goodreads. I read 54 books, read 10,585 pages. Shortest book I read was 106 pages, long was 433, for an average of 196 pages per book. And my average rating for the year was a 3.2.
Great.
Yeah, it was a lot of mid. A lot of things I wasn't too big of a fan of. But the things I did really like, I really enjoyed, which I'll get into later. But yeah, there was a lot of things I rated like 3 stars or below this year.
That's fair. I felt like my reading year was pretty mid too, but I think my average rating is higher than yours. Like mine was mid, but it wasn't that mid.
Yeah, no, mine was getting pretty down there, and usually
You're almost at a 3-star even, which is
yeah, pretty impressive actually.
Kind of terrifying, really.
Yeah.
Well, my stats, I read 63 books. I read 13,796 pages and a 3.88 average star rating, which is actually much higher than I thought, because I felt like this year I had a lot fewer things that I really loved and a lot more things that I was rating like 3.5 stars, which is unusual for me. And then I have my top 3 most read genres, which were fantasy, horror, and manga. And then I also did side note, I didn't say this, I pulled this out of a spreadsheet. I'm not using Goodreads for mine. I have a spreadsheet because why not? But my other stat that I jotted down was that I read about 55% from white authors and what's the rest of that? 45? Is that how that breaks down? 45?
Sure.
I think that maths correctly. 45% from authors of color. So I want to improve that in 2024. I think I did a little bit better in 2022 than I did in 2023. So I'm not totally happy with that. But that was just something I wanted to work on for next year. So I think we're gonna move from least favorite to best, just so that we can end the video on a high note. So we're not moving to the least favorite at the end. So least favorite book. Do you want to go first or shall I?
You go first.
Okay, my least favorite book will be unsurprising to anyone who's seen my channel in the last few months. This was a book I read for class last semester.
Exactly what this is.
Yeah, you probably didn't even need to ask what it was.
I knew what this was before I even came over this weekend.
Yeah. So I read this for a class, and I hated every second I spent reading it, but it was Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. I know a ton of people love Neal Stephenson, and I hated everything about this book. I think that the whole thing is just terrible. The writing is bad, the dialogue is bad, the characters are flat. It's all, I know this was written, logically I know this was written by a 30-year-old man, but it reads like it was written by a 16-year-old boy. Because Hero, the main character, Hero protagonist, because of course that's his name, he's good at everything, right? He's too good at everything. He's very boring. Obviously he gets the girl because he's Mr. Protagonist, literally. And then all of the women are fairly flat. I do like one character, YT, but she's severely underutilized in the story. And also I just read it Neal was putting things in here that he was going, well, that would be cool. That sounds cool. And just putting them in here without thinking at all about the ramifications of that or the implications created by that. The mafia are the good guys in here for some reason. So it just felt like a complete mess of a book. And I hated it immensely, and I had to read every single page and also flag a bunch of stuff for content warnings for some students in the class because I was a teaching intern for that class, and I had to read this carefully so I could lead discussion on it and so I could flag some content warning stuff. And there were a lot of flags, as you can tell. A lot of that was my content warning flags, the green ones and then the blue ones with the parts. And then I obviously had a lot to say, but none of it was of any substance because it was mostly just me writing.
Hell.
It was mostly putting a little emoticon, which I will put up on screen for you to view. I just put that emoticon in the margins constantly, and I think I've also written "what the fuck" a number of times. So
I will say, being in our little Discord group that we have to discuss books, this was like one big cry for help.
It was entertaining for you guys and painful for me.
Honestly, given what you were describing to us, it went past entertaining and became annoying for all of us. It was
fair. It's just bad. It's not a good book.
It was bad enough to where everything you were describing has definitely written me off trying anything from Neil Stephenson for quite a while, if not period. I
got a response on a Reddit post that I mentioned that on because it was something that was like your most hated book, and that was I put on there.
Yeah.
And I got a response. It was like, if you didn't like this one, you're not gonna like anything by Neil Stephenson because it's all like that. And I was like, oh, good.
Good shit.
That's
promising.
That's a bunch of books I don't have to read now.
Yeah, I can write off his entire back catalog.
Yeah, and he's written a lot of books, so saving myself a lot of time.
My least favorite is definitely in a different vein. So I have for this what I could consider my real answer and the answer I'm actually going to talk about. The real answer is probably Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't want to talk about this book. I don't think J.D. Vance is worth discussing. He's a horrible human being. He's shown himself to be. I don't want to give him any more credit than he's already been given or any more discussion. So instead of talking about a man taking advantage of a culture, I'm going to talk about a man taking advantage of an art form.
Okay.
And that is with Titles Ruin Everything, A Stream of Consciousness by Aubrey Graham, also known as Drake. Did you guys know Drake released a poetry book this year? Drake released a poetry book this year.
I remember you reading this book, and I think it was so bad I blocked it out of my memory.
Yeah, no, I read this in about 2 hours. I want you to imagine, how many pages does Goodreads say it is? It's about 168 pages. So imagine you take something in the same vein as like Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. Something that I didn't like to begin with when I read it. But at least with Milk and Honey and what Rupi Kaur writes, I can see where she's coming from. It's like, okay, I can see the purpose behind this, I can see the message for it, I just don't like the delivery. Mm-hmm. It is the same Instagram caption delivery that you can find in a book like Milk and Honey. But instead of having like a strong feministic stance and being, talking about relationship problems and things that are relatable, you get Instagram captions for high school boys that are on the Andrew Tate train.
Oh, good.
This gives you such great, lovely lines. Let me pull up my review. I have it. I wrote some down.
Oh, good.
There are two types of women in this world. Women who like giving head and women I don't like.
I remember that quote because you sent me that one.
You were in my dream last night. They call that a nightmare, right? Y'all more liquid than solid.
Okay.
And I'm not for you, F-O-U-R-U, really starting to put two and two together. It's 168 pages of that.
Great.
He made some of the worst poetry you can ever imagine. It really made like the people that the poets that really get dogged on, like Rupi Kaur, made her look like Sylvia fucking Plath. It was really impressive how badly he was at this. Or that's not a fucking sentence. How bad he was at this. I'm getting.
You're so worked up. You're having trouble with the words.
I'm getting riled up. So titles ruin everything, and unfortunately, Drake ruined poetry.
Well, now that we've gotten that initial dose of salt out of our veins, we can move on to most disappointing, which at least for me, I don't feel as like emphatic, I guess is the word I'm looking for there about that one. Do you want to start that one or shall I?
Go ahead. We'll just keep going back.
Okay, just back and forth. Okay. So my most disappointing book I don't actually own. This was The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Cowell, which on paper should have been a book that I loved. It's a sci-fi murder mystery about a woman who lives with chronic pain and her new husband and their little dog, and they are on their honeymoon on a ship that's traveling, I think, to Mars maybe, and on the ship, somebody turns up dead, and her husband is, like, the prime suspect, and so she is having to, like, investigate to try and figure out what's going on, and on paper, this should have been, like, a perfect book for me. But I think what ended up happening was that I really liked a lot of the, like, relationship dynamics and the characters that were included. I loved the main character, and her relationship with her husband was really sweet. And, they were really well written, and the little dog was adorable. His name is Gimlet, and I love him. But the mystery itself, I think, was fairly poorly constructed, and it felt like we weren't getting a lot of clues. So that then, at the very end, we get a wild twist that comes completely out of nowhere. And my friend read this at the same time, and she figured out what the twist was going to be very early on and still didn't like it. And I didn't see it coming, and I didn't like it because I felt like it wasn't foreshadowed very well, and there wasn't a lot of information given so that you could, like, figure out what was going on yourself. So I just got to the end, and I was like, none of what I read mattered. Because the twist just comes out of nowhere and is like none of the clues we actually had meant anything. So I was really frustrated with the mystery, and it was just disappointing because I liked so many other elements of it.
So my most disappointing of the year was actually a manga series. Mm-hmm. It's called, God, bear with me. I should have tried. Shunshunki. It's spelled Shishunki, so I think it's Shishunki Bitter Change.
Okay.
It is by Susumu Ryo, and this is a manga series that actually had to me, what hooked me in this was the premise immediately. It's about two childhood friends, a boy and a girl, who, due to some, otherworldly mishap, they go, I think the situation is that the boy is retrieving something for the girl out of a tree, and the boy falls out of the tree and lands on top of the girl, and suddenly they're swapped bodies. And then the story progresses, and actually this happens when they're like elementary school, and then the story progresses and starts where they're in high school and they're still swapped bodies. And it's them going through puberty and high school life where it's this body swap story. It's of a girl who is living in a boy's body going through puberty and vice versa, and it does some really interesting things with the idea of gender dysphoria. It does some gender roles, growing up. It's very much a good has some good coming of age story aspects to it. But what really killed my enjoyment for it is the writing was really. This is a case of an author biting off more than they can chew, at least in my opinion, because a lot of the characters have like same voice syndrome. They've, a lot of their thoughts are similar, a lot of their actions are similar. Mm-hmm. It's very different. If you were reading this in a novel format, it was going to be really difficult to be able to tell who's doing what if you weren't given names before at each and every action. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, the melodrama in this is hiked up to 11. A lot of the times, and in a lot of cases I will say that it feels undeserved. There's a lot of stakes in a lot of situations that get paid off with a lot of drama leading to it, and then it's like an episode of a TV show. It ends and moves on to the next thing without anything else playing a part in it, anything happening before playing a part in whatever comes after it. And this is especially true for the ending, which really ramps up the melodrama, and it takes care of like what could have been an entire 2 or 3 volumes worth of story in the span of like 10 chapters. And it was just so much packed into so little page content that it very much felt like it was going from a marathon to a 40-meter sprint. Mm-hmm. So the pacing, especially at the end, was weird. The writing just didn't justify the topics, which made things worse because the author does do some really interesting stuff with it at the start, but I feel like it's kind of forgotten as you go along, and it really ends up being watered down, dramatic, almost sloppy mess. at the end of everything, which led to me giving it a 2-star, the whole series a 2-star. Which is a shame because, like I said, I do really like the ideas that they were going with. I think the premise is really, really interesting. It's just they did not follow up on the premise, and they did not do it justice, at least in my opinion. I do know that this is probably I do think that, especially if you pay attention to a lot of online manga now, gender swap, body swap stuff is not uncommon, especially if you're paying attention like Twitter and Reddit. Those are pretty common themes in a lot of like online manga. And I would say this is better than what you're going to find there. There is a lot more nuance to this than what you're going to find in like your general one-shots. But I do think there's probably better examples of this out there that are done with just a little bit more nuance and with a little bit better writing quality. If y'all know me and you like that, I would love to know, because this idea does interest me. But I just wish it was executed better. That's really it. So that goes on to honorable mentions, I believe.
Yep, now we can stop talking about things we didn't like and talk about the things that we did like, which is much more fun.
Yeah.
So, shall we keep going in the same order?
Yeah, you have a lot more honorable mentions than I do.
I have a stack. I had a hard time narrowing it down for my top 3, so I have a stack of honorable mentions.
She has a stack, and I have 2.
So I'm going to run through mine real quick so that we're not lingering here too long. But to start, System Collapse by Martha Wells. I don't feel like I have to say a lot about this one anyway. It's the 7th book in the Murderbot Diary series, and I love Murderbot, and I love the direction that this took Murderbot's story, and I think we're getting at least a couple more books in the series, so I'm looking forward to seeing what that direction is going to be like. Then I'm also checking over here, because I think I have one ebook. Yeah, so my ebook was Digger Unearthed, which I just read at the end of the year, and this is a young adult graphic novel about a wombat that ends up in a mysterious place after accidentally digging a tunnel there, and she has to try to figure out how to get home, and she meets just like a wild and wacky cast of characters. It just had like a lot of really poignant moments, had a lot of heart to it, and I just really enjoyed the story of the characters. Then we have Rose House by Arcady Martine, which is a mind-bending little novella about a murder that occurs in a house that is itself an AI. The house itself is like alive, and nobody can get into the house except for the architect's former protege, and she can only go once a year, but then a body turns up dead in the house, and she and a police detective go to try and figure out what's going on. It's very mind-bending, it's very creepy and weird, and it's like definitely talking about things that are going over my head, and I need to reread it to figure out what's going on. Then we have Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead, which is a kind of murder mystery thing where we have a preacher's daughter and a boy who's kind of the like local social outcast who are like longtime friends from childhood, and a number of murders start to happen in their town, or other bodies are turning up, and they know something that nobody else does, and they're trying to figure out what's going on so that they can like preserve their own secrets. Very interesting, and I liked its like take on religion and authority. Next up, The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, first book of the First Law trilogy, and I really enjoyed all of the characters in this. This has no plot, but I didn't care because all of the characters are so interesting, and it feels like you're watching a chess game being played where the characters are the pieces and they don't know what's going on exactly. They're just being moved around the board. The reader kind of can see the different pieces being moved, but you don't really know who the players are. So it feels like there's this big thing happening and you're not quite sure what it is, but you're slowly finding out pieces of it. And my last honorable mention is You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kaylin Barron, which is a young adult slasher that I thought was just really brilliant and did a lot of interesting things with its characters' knowledge of the genre. And it had my jaw on the floor when I finished it. And I read it in a spooky cabin over the summer, which was fun. So it was a good reading experience, just kind of in general. Okay.
Okay, I also have honorable mentions. I actually have more than 2, which I'll get to in a minute.
Okay.
First off is a manga series. It is Brutal, Confessions of a Homicide Investigator, which is by Kei Kogo, and then illustrated by Ryo Isawa. This is about a homicide detective who is also a serial killer on the side, who he is taking, due to religious reasons, he is picking off the worst of the worst and killing them in equally brutal manners to the crimes that they're committing. This is like watching a train wreck, quite in the best way possible. It is you have these fucking comic book villains that are being just evil to the most absurd degree, and then Mr. Hiroki Dan is coming in to save the day and doing the most fucked up thing imaginable. It was a very morbid read, but I had the most fucked up little smile on my face the entire time I was reading it.
A little bit Dexter-like.
Very Dexter.
Yeah.
Like, if you like Dexter, you need to find Brutal. It's right in that same vein. Second one's a nonfiction book. It is Blue in the Search of Nature's Rarest Color by Kai Kupferschmidt. This is a scientific book that doesn't go too super deep into a ton of thing, but instead takes a shotgun approach. So it talks a lot about biology, geology, metallurgy, a whole bunch of the science of making colors. It goes into a lot of different science fields and talks about what makes blue so rare in naturally occurring nature, and the reason why people have spent so long trying to chase after making their own different shades of blue pigments. So I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's not too deep. The layman can easily read this and find a lot of enjoyment out of it, so I highly recommend that. And then there are two quick books that I want to mention that are tied to, they're more like art books that I read this year. Their first is Gorilla's Rise of the Ogre. This was written in 2005, around the time that they were releasing Demon Days. It's kind of half art book, half more like lore about the Gorillaz band, not the Damon Albarn and people who actually make the music, but Tootie, Murdoch, Noodle, Russ, the people, the characters that are part of the band. So if you're interested in Gorillaz, I highly recommend it. However, you will have to find a digital copy, because physical copies usually cost around $200 to $300 online.
Great.
Yeah, they printed it once and never again. And then the second one is let me get the official, it's the official design works for Persona 4. Not too much about this. I love Persona 4. The art book is really cool. They go into a lot of design detail as to the designs between the characters, a lot of pre-production stuff for both characters and their personas, as well as a lot of the stuff that you'll find in the Shin Megami Tensei universe as well. So if you're interested in either of those franchises, if you're able to find copies of them digitally or physical, I highly recommend both of those. They're a lot of fun for their own little reasons. Okay,
so moving into, finally, the best books of the year. This was very hard for me to narrow down. There were so many books that could have been on this list.
We doing this like a 3-2-1, or we just...
I didn't rank mine. I just kind of have them in whatever order.
I'll go in whatever I see this in.
Fair. So my first one that I want to talk about is Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which was one of my most anticipated books of the year. This is a very slow-paced horror story about these two people whose names are, of course, gonna just completely escape my brain now that I'm talking about it. Montserrat and Tristan. Anyway, about Montserrat and Tristan. Montserrat is a sound engineer in the film industry, and at this point it's taking place in like 80s Mexico, and at this point actually is it the 90s? I think it's the 90s, but she's in this very like male-dominated industry. She's not really taken seriously, but she's very good at her job. And then Tristan is her childhood best friend, and he is an actor who was in an accident several years ago, and so it's kind of like halted his acting career, and he's trying to get back up on his feet. But they have this kind of long-running friendship that started around movies, and Tristan moves into a new apartment, and his new neighbor turns out to be the director of some of their favorite horror movies from when they were younger, except that he had a movie that he never completed that was supposedly cursed, and he, after meeting Tristan and Montserrat, asks them to help him complete that movie. And he thinks that that's going to break the curse, but they get kind of dragged into the situation that's full of like magic and Nazi occultism and just all kinds of wild stuff. And this is a really interesting read because it is very slow. There's a lot of like rising tension, and I felt like that was really well done. But there's also just like lots of stuff about the film industry, particularly about like the 60s to 90s film industry in Mexico. And there's lots of just like historical detail packed in, and it's very, I would say, character driven. It's about Montserrat and Tristan and their kind of individual struggles that they're going through. And it's also about like the director and basically like the things that he got into when he was younger. And the villain in this is very scary. I thought he was very creepy. and I just felt like everything in here was so well done. The ending does get pretty wild. There's some sudden like fantasy and magic elements that kind of come out of nowhere, but like in a good way. They're not out of nowhere, I guess. They are like foreshadowed, but it does go from being like slow and drawn out and kind of rising tension to kind of high octane action in a way that I thought was really well done, and I really enjoyed it. So I had a lot of fun with this one. I know some people have had mixed reviews on this, but I personally love this one. I think it's a fantastic horror novel.
So I'm going to start with, I mentioned my least favorite poetry book of the year. I do want to mention my favorite, which is Actual Air by David Berman. David Berman was, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he was primarily a musician, known for his own solo work, but mainly due to his two main projects, which were Silver Jews and Purple Mountain. But however, he did a lot of writing. He did do some poetry. Actual Air is his most known collection of poetry outside of his own music. And for those of you who are familiar with any Silver Jews discography or the One Purple Mountain album that he released prior to his suicide, his writing style is very blunt. There's a very unforgiving aspect to it, but he does like his fair bit of dry humor, which to me adds quite a bit of flavor to it. I really like how he mixes these very unforgiving emotions, but does so using some comparisons or similes that add a little bit of humor to it, which for me, I love that. That's very similar. I do have myself like to think I've got a relatively dry and somewhat dark sense of humor about certain things, and this really appealed to me, especially after learning about Berman's eventual passing as a result of his suicide. It does kind of, as sad as it is, there is some added impact to a lot of what he says in this book because of what eventually happened. But this does not, regardless of what happened there, this does not stop this from being a really, really good collection of poetry. Unfortunately, it does, if you're wanting a physical copy of it, it does kind of sit in that same zone as Rise of the Ochre by Gorillaz, in that it's only really been printed once. And unfortunately, it's become a little bit sought after for very good reasons. This is, like I said, this is a phenomenal collection. I loved nearly every poem that was in this. So I definitely, if you're able to get your hands on a digital copy, which would be easier than a physical one, do give this a read. Especially if you're familiar with Berman's work, I would say this is a must read. And do listen to Silver Jews and Purple Mountains, because it's really, really good kind of indie folk music. And rest in peace, David Berman. I
feel like the next book I want to talk about, though, kind of weirdly applicable to this end of your discussion there, because the next book that I had on my favorites is very much like a book about grief. Mm-hmm. And like the loss of people that we care about. Yeah. So my next one that I want to talk about, that I read this at the end of the year, and the only reason I didn't sob while reading it was that I was finishing it up while I was at work, and so I was trying desperately not to like be sobbing at my desk. My next book was Mammoth at the Gates by Nevo, which is the fourth book, I believe, in the Singing Hills cycle of novellas. And I've loved every book in this series, but this one in particular is like my favorite so far. So this one is following Chi, who is a cleric who travels around collecting stories, and they are, for the first time in the series, returning home to the Singing Hills Abbey to kind of reunite with their friends and their, I can't remember the word, it's a talking bird who helps them collect stories, but Chi is returning to the Abbey only to find that the Abbey is itself experiencing a bit of a conflict because somebody very close to Chi has recently passed, and there is a conflict over what funeral rites this person should be given, whether it should be the Abbey's funeral rites or another set of funeral rites, because there is a extended family involved. And so there's this conflict happening at the Abbey, and she just kind of gets dropped into the middle of it while also suddenly finding out about the passing of this person they cared very deeply about. And so it's about their grief and kind of coming to terms with that loss, but also all the ways that the other characters are also grieving this person. And it's about also like, how do you encapsulate a life in stories, because they're all kind of remembering this person. And then there's also this, I think, really interesting element where the book is discussing like that people we love can sometimes have done bad things, And that doesn't mean that they're not good people or that they're not worthy of love, but that's just like a part of the more complex picture of a person as a whole. And I just really thought that was interesting, and I think it just hit like a little bit too close to home. This was the first year that we went through Christmas after my grandmother passed last year, right before Christmas. And so there were elements of this story that, like, kind of coming around to that anniversary just hit me really hard, but like in a really positive way. And I just think it's a really beautiful story and so worth reading. And I'm so excited to see what we're getting next in this series, because I've loved every book so far, but like I said, this is definitely my favorite one in the series so far, because it's just beautifully written and just talks about grief in such a beautiful and interesting way.
So my next one is probably my favorite manga of the year, and that is Telework Yotobanashi by Kintetsu Yamada, who, for those of you who are not familiar, is the same author behind the manga Sweat and Soap. So this is a real short manga that she released at the tail end of 2022, going into the start of 2023. It is about it's set in the pandemic, and is about a office worker who is now working from home, getting to know his neighbor who is an archaeologist, and they bond and eventually form this deep bond while they're working from home. It's a really cute little romance story. I really, really liked it. Characters, as always with Yamada's work, are really down to earth, really realistic. The ways that they progress through things are very natural, and it also helps that the characters are really endearing as well. There's not really anything super special in my opinion about this. It's just a really good kind of slice of life romance story that is done in like 25 chapters. I think it takes up a single volume. By the way, it is getting an English translated physical release later this year. I don't know what the actual English title is going to be, because I really doubt it's going to be Telework Yotobanashi.
Probably not.
Probably not. So I don't know. So whatever they end up calling it, I don't know what it is at this point. But I do know they have announced that it is getting an English physical release, which I'll be picking up whenever that happens. I think it's going to be sometime in the summer. But yeah, if you're interested in that, if you're interested in just low key cute stories, I highly recommend it. I imagine it caught a lot of attention online, so if you are kind of on the online manga community, you have probably heard about this, because it got really, really popular on places like Twitter and Reddit. So, but yeah, I really enjoyed it, especially for being as short as it is.
I cheated ever so slightly, because I have chosen...
I know what you've done.
Yes. I have chosen a full duology as my last entry. So, like, the story as a whole is my favorite reading experience from this year. I didn't rank them, but I did intentionally leave this one for last, because it is my favorite thing I've read. It has changed me the most of anything else I've read, and it haunts me. It's The Radiant Emperor Duology by Shelley Parker Chan. And I'm not the same person I was before I started reading these books.
True.
Yeah, because you witnessed.
Yeah,
you witnessed me reading these.
She's not joking.
So these, if you haven't encountered them yet, the first book was a part of the like Sapphic Trifecta, which came out, I think it was like 2020 or 2021. But there were 3 different books that were released that all had like saffron colored covers that were all like sapphic, all involved sapphic romances. And so this was one of those 3. And this story as a whole is a gender-bent retelling of the rise of the Ming Dynasty in 14th century China. And it is following a young girl whose brother dies very young, and she ends up taking up his identity to try and grab his fate, because he has been told that his fate is greatness, basically. And she is told that her fate is nothing. And so she takes his identity and tries to grab his fate, and she's chasing that throughout this story. And then in the first book, we're getting her perspective, and then also her rival. I wouldn't say he's quite an enemy exactly, but he's her rival, and they're on opposite sides of a war, but they're also like 2 sides of the same coin. And that's General Ouyang of the Mongol Empire. And he has his own storyline that is heartbreaking and so difficult and so fascinating. But then the second book opens up the world a lot by adding a couple more character perspectives. In this one, we're primarily getting Zhe, and who's the protagonist. I don't think I ever said her name, Zhe Changba, and General Ouyang. And then in the second book, we get more additional perspectives. I think there's 4 main POVs in that one. Throughout them, we also get like other small, short POVs from other characters. But the way that this book talks about gender and embodiment and like lived experience and people making spaces for themselves in oppressive systems is just fascinating. You have Zhe, who is taking her brother's identity, and throughout most of the series is passing herself off as a young man, but ultimately kind of settles in this spot where she doesn't believe that she fits the gender binary. She continues to use she, her pronouns, but like there's this really interesting exploration of her like experience, her like embodied experience as somebody who isn't fitting into the binary expected of her society. You have General Ouyang, who feels like he's been robbed of his masculinity. We have some more characters I won't mention in book 2 that are both doing some really interesting things through embracing femininity in interesting and different ways. And so it's really like thematically rich, but also everything in here is so hard to read. These characters are in peril. Parker Chan does not back away from endangering her characters or like hurting them. And this is one of those series where nobody is safe, and it's such an intense reading experience, and I highly recommend if you're going to read these that you need to be like in a pretty comfortable mindset to be reading them, because they are very difficult. And I also suggest looking up content warnings, because this has a lot of them. I can't remember most of them off the top of my head, but like highly recommend looking that up as well. I love this series. I'm a different person since reading it, and I really want to reread it. If I had the opportunity, I was taking a class on gender and sexuality last semester, and if I'd known I had the opportunity, because I kind of did, I would have written a paper on these, because they are just fascinating, and I could talk about these all day. Also, these copies are particularly beautiful. These are the Illumicrate editions. This is the only Illumicrate book that I got while I had my subscription that I then intentionally went out and got the second one. It's the only series that I felt that strongly about, that I wanted the like matching editions. So I love these immensely, and I could talk about them forever, but I'm going to stop now so that Jacob can talk about his last book, because otherwise we're going to be here for a while, because I could just talk about these endlessly, and I don't want to spoil anything, and if I even tell you who some of the characters are in this one, it would be a spoiler for book 1. So, love these. They broke me entirely, but like in a good way, but also in kind of a bad way, because I was sad. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It's an experience is what it is.
So going back to a depressing thread, I will say that this is probably my book of the year, just because it's the one book that I've like gone back to and thought about the most, and that is Swim by Eric Watt. This book it stuck with me for quite a while afterward, because there's so much going on with it. The book is about a man who he's an Asian American man living in Los Angeles, I believe, somewhere in California. He's a gay man. He's a meth addict, and one day when he is while he's high, and he's partying with another man, because of the fact that he's high, he missed phone calls from his father, finding out that his mother has died. And so he's then thrust into this family situation to where he is trying to care for his father, who very much did not take care of everything. His mother was very much the person that, handled all the business, all the matters in the family. So his father is in a lot of ways helpless and does not want to help. They're also caring for his 99-year-old grandmother who has dementia, and they also have to work around that as well. Getting reintroduced in the family, the fact that he's not out to a lot of his family, and now they're dealing with some cultural differences, all while putting off and fighting his meth addiction. Anyone that has heard me talk on this channel before knows I love a good family drama. Love some good family-based stuff. And this, to me, is a really, really good example of a family drama done right. The characters themselves, there is drama, there is a little bit of melodrama, but everything feels very earned. Everything feels like it has its place. It's deserved. Everything makes sense. You know, all the characters progress in a fashion because these are situations that you can read. You know, I guarantee you can probably talk to someone in real life or get online and read and experience from somebody of having to help their family in one way or another after the passing of a family member, whether it be a mother, a father, you know, a patriarch, a matriarch of the family in any way, shape, or form, and they're having to come in from there and deal with their own problems after being away, and then coming back and suddenly having this culture clash with their own family. So it is a really, really interesting book because of that. I think Eric Watt does a phenomenal job of talking about some really specific things. Admittedly, a lot of it does kind of focus on being an Asian American person in America and a lot of some stigma and cultural things that go along with that. Myself being a white person, I can't really relate to any of that. But in general, I think the reason I enjoy it is because he does a really, really well done family drama with good fleshed out characters and with good, you know, with sensible directions and sensible conflicts, and they go through it in sensible manners. It also helps that it's also just really, really fucking really well written. Like, this is, I was glued to the page the entire time I was reading this. I don't know if I can gush about it as long as you can with She Became the Sun, because you can go for hours on that. But
I'm unstoppable.
True. But I can't, you know, I don't want to keep going about it. There's only so many different ways I can say, yeah, this book's really good. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Especially if you're into family drama, if you're into things about other cultures, you know, that you may not be too familiar with, give it a shot. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think that about wraps it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that about wraps it up. And that's all of our worst to best. So, success. We've done it. We've wrapped up 2023 finally.
Yep.
Finally found time to do it. So, I'm really glad that we finally got a chance to film this because it was fun to look back at the year. And I really hope that y'all have enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you consider giving a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.
Bye.